All right, yesterday we began looking at the introduction of Luke's Gospel, and we saw that there were we have different questions there. First of all, why was Luke's Gospel written? We saw that it was written primarily to Theophilus, but also then to us, so that we would know the exact truth about everything that had been taught previously. So evidently there was information that Theophilus had prior to Luke writing concerning Jesus. And of course, any Christian church established in that time period would have had information about Jesus, right? But it was all oral. It was people telling them. And so Luke is filling in some of the details. We saw that Luke himself was not an eyewitness to what happened to Jesus, but he relied upon other sources. He did research. And so he had access to apostolic material. He had access to written records of oral traditions, things that had been passed on orally, and some people wrote those things down. And then, of course, he had living eyewitnesses, such as Paul, James, Mark, Barnabas, Silas, Philip the evangelist, Agabus the prophet, Manasseh, an old disciple, the shepherds, Mary the mother of Jesus, Elizabeth the mother of John the Baptist, and so on. So these are all people that were alive at the time with whom he could have communicated. And then we saw that the reason why he wrote this gospel, in particular, what makes it different than the other gospels, is that he wrote it in consecutive order. So of any of the gospels, this one was written in chronological order. All right, now we come to John's prologue, and we see here the pre-existence of the Messiah. This is something that only John really deals with, and that's paragraph 2 of our questions. Before we look at the questions, and you can turn to John chapter 1 while we're beginning to look at this, and we're going to find that in John 1, the word is used, and to us it may not be all that significant. Anybody know what the Greek word for word is? Maybe you've heard this before. What's the word for word? The word is logos. Does that sound familiar? You've heard the word logos before? No? None of you? All right. Well, it is the word logos. And in Aramaic, which is the native language of Jesus and the disciples, including John, the word is memra. That's similar to the Hebrew. It's used in the Targums, which is the prophets, around 500 times with different shades of meaning. Now, for the Greek reader, for the person who had been raised as a Gentile, to hear the word, especially if they're familiar with Greek philosophy, they would have understood the word logos as a philosophical term which indicates the mind that's behind the universe. So there is a mind, there is wisdom there. And so John is using a term that has meaning both for Jews and Gentiles, and wraps it all up into Jesus. And you think of maybe an example of both the Greek and the Jewish concept of word and wisdom is found in the book of Proverbs, where we're told, to get wisdom is personified. Well, in a way, Jesus is that wisdom personified. And so he is the Word. All right, let's begin looking at the scriptures here and see if we can answer the questions as we go along. So let's read. You've memorized John 1 through 3 already, but let's look through this. And we are, let's see, I don't have the verses written down. All right, let's read 1 through 5. Yes, verses 1 through 5. Would someone like to read that for us? Any volunteers to read verses 1 through 5? Who has a good strong voice? No one? No one wants to read? I don't want to force you. All right, thank you.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Okay, let's stop right there. What do we see there already?
Word.
We have the word or the word logos. because it sounds so silly to say the word word. I'm going to start calling it logos, okay? So we have the word logos here. And what do we see about the logos? First of all, we think of a word, a word which is word. We think of something which is written. But what is different about this word? It's not written or spoken. What is it?
It was God.
Well, what is the word here, the word logos, indicating? Is it indicating something which is written on a page? Is it something which is spoken? What is it?
Something that exists.
It's something that exists. And in fact, we could probably say it's someone that exists, right? So it's a person. So, and what do we see about this person? What's the first thing we see that's true about this person?
He was in the beginning. He was with God.
He was in the beginning. When's the beginning?
Beginning.
The beginning of what? What do you think that, what do you mean, what does he mean here by in the beginning?
Creation.
Yeah, creation. That's the beginning of time, right? So in the beginning is when everything begins. And it says that this Logos was in the beginning. So Logos was there when time began. Right? You see that? Okay, what's the next thing we see about the Logos?
It was with God.
He was with God. Now, what does that indicate to us? What does that tell us? That he is with God. What might we think, if we didn't read the rest of this verse, what might we think about the Logos in relationship to God? It says he's with God.
He's not God.
That he's not God, right? But he's with him. He's standing beside him, but he's not really God. We might think that if we just read this part, right? So there's a separation between God and Logos. But then what's the next thing say? John wants to make sure we're clear on this. What's the next thing? Noah?
All things remain free.
No, the very next thing after he was with God, what's the very next thing? Marissa?
He is God.
Okay, it says he was God, doesn't it? Yeah. It said the word was God. He was with God, but he's not separate from God. He was God. Now, how is that possible? How can you be separate from something and still be that something? You can't, right? But when we're talking about God, he can. So he is both with God. So there's a separation between Logos and we understand God here in the sense of being God the Father. But he also was God in that he is very much God as God the Father is. So we have here a hint at what we understand later is the triunity of God. Although the Holy Spirit's not mentioned, we see that there are two different persons here that are both God. So he's with God and he was God. Seems like a contradiction, but it's not. It's a description of who the Logos is. And then it says he was in the beginning with God. So not only was he in the beginning, but he was in the beginning with God. He's always been with God, and he also is God. And then we get to his role in creation. Okay, let's look back at our questions here. Some of this is still a little bit of background to the word. Number 6, and I'll give you what goes into these blanks, and you can just write down on your piece of paper what goes in the blank, since you have the question there on Google Classroom. Number 6, the word word is the means by which covenants were made. Covenants. C-O-V-E-N-A-N-T-S. Now, what is a covenant? How would you describe a covenant? Could, in the context of a promise, could be a covenant. Any other words you can think of that would describe a covenant? There's a promise usually made as a part of it. An agreement between two parties. So in the ancient world, there might be a covenant between nations. That would be like a treaty between them, an agreement. There might be a covenant between people to agree on how they're going to treat one another, or what one person's going to do for them, or even so simple as I'm going to buy grain from you and here's how much I'll pay for it. Those are all types of agreements or covenants. And the word logos or memra is used in those kind of contexts. And I give you a scripture there, Genesis 15, that you can look at. Number 7 is not only the means by which covenants are made, but it's the means of salvation. Hosea 1:7 in the Targums, remember Targums is the prophets, says, I, Yahweh, will save them by the memra, or the word of Yahweh. So Yahweh God says, I will save them by the word of Yahweh. So it's his word that brings salvation. Number 8, it's a means of revelation. Means of revelation. We learned all about revelation last year in Bible doctrine class. Dwight Pentecost in his work says this: when God in the Old Testament appeared to reveal himself or to reveal truth to men, the revealer was referred to as memra, which is a Hebrew word for a word. It emphasized that which was communicated from God rather than the God who made the revelation. So what was communicated from God was called the memra, or the word. In Greek, it would be called logos. Number 9, we find that the word is the agent of creation. We see that in Psalm 33:4. In other words, what we know from Scripture is that God spoke the worlds into existence. It was by his word that came forth that everything came into being. Number 10, at times the word is used for God himself. At times it is God. At other times it is considered distinct from God. There is personality associated with the term, and there are several verses there that indicate that. Sometimes it is treated as a person, and we see that when that is the case, that it is the person of the second member of the triunity of God. Number 11, the word is an agent of God, by which Old Testament theophanies took place. Theophanies, T-H-E-O, P-H-A-N-I-E-S, theophanies. Now, you all remember what a theophany is. We talked about that last year, so somebody remind us in case there's someone whose memory is lacking at this point. What's a theophany? What's a theophany, Nate? You don't know? Noel, what's the theophany?
Like God revealing himself,
How?
like in a human form.
Right, exactly. So God reveals himself in a human form. He's not really human, but he makes himself look like a human so that he can communicate with somebody, talk with them. That's a theophany. Number 12, John's point is that everything you have been taught by the rabbis concerning the memra is true of Jesus Christ. So his message to the Jewish leadership is everything that you've heard about memra in the Old Testament, word, that's true of Jesus Christ. All right, now, number 13, we have in verse 1 his identity in relationship to God the Father. And those are the verses we just read. His relationship to God the Father. All right, now we've already talked about this, so this should be easy. Number 14, what does John have to say about the origin of Christ? What does John have to say about the origin of Christ? Sam, what's he say?
He was in the beginning.
Yeah, so he has always been God. He has always been God, right? He has no origin because he was in the beginning. He has always been God. Number 15, the pre-existence. The pre-existence. You understand that word, don't you? To exist beforehand. The pre-existence of the Son before his advent, that is his coming into the world, is indicated in what words? What words in verse 1 indicate that the Son existed before he came into the world, before he was born?
In the beginning.
Okay, that's true. Because he's in the beginning. What else? Joel?
He was in the beginning with God.
He was with God, and he was God. So since we've already talked about the beginning here in number 14, number 15, let's put with God and was God. In the beginning is also a good answer there. With God and was God. Number 16. The Son was a distinct personality from the Father, as indicated in what words? What words indicate that he is a distinct personality from the Father? Emma? Mia?
He was with God.
With God. The fact that he is with God indicates he is distinct from God the Father. With God. All right, so number 17. What two things does John tell us about the relationship between Christ and God? What's one thing that he tells us then about the relationship between Christ and God? We've already gone over this. What's the first thing? Jordan?
That he is God. He was God.
Okay, let's put that as number 2, that he is God. So his essence, very essence, is that he is God. And what do we see prior to that about his relationship to God the Father? Lexi?
He was.
Which means what?
He was separate.
So he is distinct from God the Father, or separate from God the Father in a way. I hate to use the word separate because that could mean something else, but he is distinct from God the Father, and he is God. So those are the two things we understand from he is with God and was God. All right, number 18. Then the deity of the Son, that is that he is God, is indicated with what words? This is a softball question. You know what a softball question is? Yeah, it's really easy to hit softball, isn't it? Some of you may not think so, but compared to a baseball, it's easy. So what words indicate that the Son is actually deity? Jonas.
He is God.
Well, the text says he was God. Was God. He is God, but the text says was God. All right? Number 19, the eternality of the Son is indicated in what words? What words would you point to show that the Son has been around eternally? That he is an eternal being? Joel?
In the beginning was the Word.
You could say, yeah, that would fit too. I was looking at something similar to that. I was looking at the same was in the beginning with God, but they both talk about being in the beginning, so those would both fit. Just the fact that he is in the beginning. All right, number 20 looks at verse 3. Which says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So this is his identity in relationship to, what do you think?
Creation.
Creation, good. His identity in relationship to creation. Notice we have his identity in relationship to God the Father, and now his identity in relationship to creation. Okay, and number 21 says to read the following verses and summarize their meaning in relation to this point. So in order to save time, let's divide the verses up. So I need a volunteer for Colossians 1:16, Sean. Hebrews 1:2, Joel. Psalm 19:1, Griff. And Romans 1:20, Brenna. Okay, as soon as you have Colossians 1, read it for us. And everybody think, when you hear the verses, how you'll answer this question, how you summarize their meaning.
So verse 16.
1:16.
For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him.
Okay, and then Hebrews 1:2.
But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world.
Psalm 19:1.
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork.
And Romans 1:20.
For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. And the things that have been made, so they are without excuse.
All right, so what all these verses have in common? What are they all indicating?
All things were made through him.
Okay, through
God.
And we know specifically in John here, as well as a couple other verses, that which member of the Godhead is involved in creation. Which person of the Godhead specifically? Yeah, through the Son, the Word. All right. So Jesus Christ is the Creator. Most of those verses had to do with Jesus Christ as the Creator. Some of them also gave us something else. Did anybody get anything else out of those verses about him being the Creator and the result of that? We could say, especially, I think it was Psalm 19:1, that he receives glory from his creation. So, two things we can put down here from these verses. One, that Jesus Christ is the Creator, and secondly, he receives glory from his creation. Any questions, comments? All right, let's go to the next verses 4 and 5, and then jumping down to 10 through 13. And here we see his identity and relationship to men. All right, who would read verses 4 and 5 for us? Volunteer to read 4 and 5. Come on, you guys. This has got to be a participatory class. Everybody here can read, I think. Morgan, 4 and 5.
In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not come overcome it.
Okay, now let's jump down to verses 10 through 13. Who will read that? Okay, Mia, you haven't read yet today.
He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of the man, but God.
All right, so what do we see here? Number 23. Looking back at verses 4 and 5. Jesus is the source of all what? What would you say, Joel?
Life.
Life. Life. Hebrew, l'chaim. Life. And what do you see then he is the revealer of? Of what is he the revealer? Of what is he the revealer? All right, Joel?
Light.
Light. He's the revealer of light, which means the knowledge of God. So Jesus, the Word, is the one that gives life, and he also reveals God. He's the giver of light. Life and light come from him. Now, what's the irony of John 1:10? Look at John 1:10. You all understand irony, don't you? What's the irony in John 1:10? John?
Everything was made through him, but the world did not know him.
Yeah, the very ones that Jesus created didn't accept him, didn't know him. He was not known by the very ones that he created. Something along those lines. All right, I will read the next passage for you, number 26, Romans 1:18 to 23. As I'm reading, I want you to think about how you would summarize what's being said there in relationship to the point we just made. That is, that those that were created didn't know the Creator. All right, listen carefully. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So how does Paul inform us further about what we just read in John? How would you summarize what Paul has said here that relates to what John has just communicated? Jonas?
They know he exists, but they won't listen or accept that he created everything.
Yeah. So what Paul's telling us is all you got to do is look around, and you know that God exists. But they willingly were ignorant. And so when John tells us that those that he created, that Jesus created, did not know him, we know from what Paul says that was a willing ignorance, because they could see God all around. They were willingly ignorant of him. All right, as you notice here in John 1, there is a contrast made between light and darkness. And it looks like our time is going to expire on us. So I want you to do this. For Monday, we're not ready for section 4 yet, so ignore the assignment that's up there on the board. But I want you to do this. Continue looking at section 2 here, and look at number 27. Be prepared to discuss the conflict between light and darkness. Number 28, look over the following chart and be prepared to explain it. And then we will continue with the rest of the questions in section 2 on Monday. All right? So be prepared to discuss 27 and 28. We'll continue together with the other questions to finish up section 2. Any questions? Just be able to think and talk. Participate on Monday. Not just a couple people.